We all harbor a deeply seductive fantasy of winning the lottery, believing that a sudden mountain of cash would instantly solve every single one of our problems. We imagine a life of limitless leisure, where we buy whatever we desire, quit our jobs forever, and live like royalty without a care in the world. However, the annals of history teach us a much darker lesson about the nature of unearned prosperity and the corrosive effect it has on the human soul. Sudden and immense wealth is often not a blessing to be cherished, but a virulent virus that infects the host and slowly destroys it from within. This is the tragic and spectacular story of the Spanish Empire, a civilization that rose to dizzying heights only to fall victim to its own success. In the 16th century, the Spanish did not just win the lottery. They discovered the bank and unlocked the largest source of silver the world had ever seen. They became the undisputed masters of the earth, the first true global empire on which the sun never set, stretching across oceans and continents with absolute authority. They possessed the most feared army in Europe, the largest ships to sail the seas, and a firm belief that they had a direct line to God. Yet, despite having every advantage, they watched their magnificent empire burn to the ground, consumed by the very treasure that was supposed to make them invincible. They were forced to learn the hardest lesson in economics, that gold is not wealth, but rather a potent drug that can lead to a fatal overdose. To truly understand the roots of this tragedy, we must travel back in time to a barren and freezing plateau high in the Andes Mountains of modern Bolivia. The year is 1545, and the location is a desolate place called Potosí, a windswept region that would soon become the center of the economic world. Before this moment, Spain was already a powerful nation, but it was not yet the economically invincible superpower that would soon dominate the entire globe. They were a society of hardened warriors fresh from the Reconquista, a centuries-long struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule through blood and steel. Deeply religious and forged in the fires of constant warfare, the Spanish nobility valued the sharpness of the sword far more than the accounting of the ledger. But the trajectory of history changed forever when a local indigenous man named Diego Gualpa stumbled while chasing a wayward llama across the steep mountain slopes. To catch his balance on the treacherous terrain, he desperately grabbed a bush, and as the roots pulled away from the earth, he saw something incredible. Beneath the soil lay shimmering veins of pure silver, exposing the heart of the Cerro Rico, the rich hill that would change the destiny of nations. It was a geological freak of nature, a mountain that was practically made of solid silver ore waiting to be ripped from the earth by greedy hands. When the Spanish conquistadors finally arrived to inspect the find, they could not believe their eyes, realizing this was the El Dorado they had been searching for. They immediately set to work, and Potosí transformed almost overnight from a desolate, freezing wasteland into one of the largest cities in the world. Within a few short decades, this remote mining camp boasted a population larger than London or Paris, a sprawling metropolis in the middle of nowhere. It was a city fueled by unadulterated greed and violence, perched at 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air was dangerously thin. The altitude was so extreme that Spanish aristocrats would gasp for breath just walking down the street, their lungs struggling in the oxygen-deprived atmosphere. But to get the silver out of the rock, Spain needed massive amounts of labor, and this is where their economic miracle turned into a human nightmare. The Spanish administration instituted the infamous Mita system, a mandatory and brutal draft of indigenous labor that enslaved the local population. Tens of thousands of indigenous men were torn from their homes and forced into the dark, suffocating tunnels to work until they collapsed. They worked in grueling, week-long shifts without seeing the sun, existing in a subterranean hell of dust, darkness, and despair. These laborers carried heavy sacks of silver ore, up rickety, vertical ladders, risking their lives with every step they took toward the surface. It was grimly whispered at the time that if you squeezed the silver coins of Spain, drops of indigenous blood would drip out. The locals gave the Cerro Rico a new and terrifying name, calling it the mountain that eats men, a beast that consumed human lives for profit. Yet, simply digging the ore was only half the battle, as the rock was low grade and difficult to refine using traditional heating methods. To extract the pure silver, the Spanish implemented a new industrial technology known as the mercury amalgamation process, a toxic chemical revolution. They mixed the crushed rock with poisonous mercury and forced men to trample the slurry with their bare feet to separate the precious metal. This process allowed Spain to extract silver at an industrial scale never before seen in human history, turning the mountain into a factory. The output was absolutely staggering. Between 1550 and 1800, Mexico and Peru produced 80% of the world's entire supply of silver. Most of this treasure flowed directly to Spain, where it was melted down into bars and minted into the most famous coin in history. This was the Piece of Eight, the first true global currency, effectively becoming the dollar of the Renaissance and the standard for trade. It was accepted without question in markets from Shanghai to Seville and from Boston to Bombay, unifying the global economy under Spanish silver. The Spanish Empire had successfully monetized the earth, creating a currency that was universally recognized as the ultimate symbol of value and power. Twice a year, the Flota de Indias, or treasure fleets, would gather in the tropical harbor of Havana to prepare for the dangerous Atlantic crossing. These were massive convoys of heavy galleons, riding dangerously low in the water, weighed down by billions of dollars in today's currency. When the sails finally appeared on the horizon off the coast of Spain, church bells would ring out in joyous celebration across the entire country. The king breathed a heavy sigh of relief, while the bankers in the shadows rubbed their hands together, knowing their loans were finally secured. The party could continue for another year, and the collective delusion of eternal prosperity was maintained for both the crown and the commoner. Spain became the superpower of Europe instantly, projecting force with an apparently endless supply of silver to fund their grand military ambitions. They commanded the tercios, the feared infantry squares that were practically undefeated on the battlefield, a moving wall of pikes and gunpowder. They built massive, ornate cathedrals adorned with real gold leaf, physical testaments to their devotion and their seemingly bottomless pockets. Now the King of Spain, Charles V, and later his son Philip II, were the undisputed masters of the known universe. They firmly believed that God had chosen Spain to lead the world and protect the faith, a divine mandate backed by mountains of silver. But in their hubris, they made a fatal calculation that would eventually unravel everything they had built and destroy their economic foundation. They looked at their towering piles of silver bars and confidently said, "We are rich," mistaking the symbol of value for value itself. They did not realize that they were actually planting the seeds of their own destruction with every shipment that landed on their shores. They were making the classic economic error of confusing money with wealth, a subtle distinction that is invisible until it is too late. Money is just a medium of exchange, a token used to trade. Wealth is the actual ability to produce things like food, clothes, and tools. Spain had found what looked like infinite money, but in the process, they were about to stop producing actual, real-world wealth. The silver was acting like a powerful narcotic, providing a massive high and a feeling of absolute invincibility to the Spanish state. But deep inside the economy, the vital organs were shutting down one by one as the easy money slowly poisoned the system. The farmers were leaving the fields to seek their fortune in the cities, and the skilled blacksmiths were putting down their hammers. Why work hard to produce goods when the ships are coming in full of silver, ready to buy anything you need from abroad? The economic addiction had begun, and it spread through the streets of Spain like a fever, altering the behavior of every citizen. To understand how this happened, imagine for a moment that you are a humble shoemaker living in the bustling city of Seville in 1550. Seville is the gateway to the Americas, the boomtown of the world, where every ship that docks brings a new wave of fortune. Suddenly, the treasure fleets arrive, and sailors pour off the decks with their pockets bulging with silver, eager to spend their earnings. The nobles have money, the soldiers have money, and suddenly everyone in the city is clamoring to buy your shoes at the same time. So, you do what any rational businessman would do in that situation. You raise your prices to match the overwhelming demand. Now, imagine this same scenario happening to everyone, everywhere, all at once. The baker, the landlord, and the weaver all raise their rates. This phenomenon is what economic historians call the price revolution, and it was the first major inflationary crisis in modern history. As tons of silver flooded into the Spanish economy, the supply of money skyrocketed, but the supply of actual goods remained exactly the same. There were twice as many coins chasing the same number of shoes and loaves of bread, inevitably driving the value of the currency down. In previous centuries, prices in Europe had been remarkably flat. A loaf of bread cost roughly the same in 1500 as it did in 1400. But now, prices in Spain exploded, rising by over 400%, a shock that the medieval economic system was completely unprepared to handle. In a modern economy, we are used to small amounts of inflation, but in the 16th century, this rapid increase was an absolute catastrophe. It shattered the unwritten social contract, creating a chaotic environment where the rules of survival changed faster than people could adapt. The poor were absolutely crushed as their wages remained stagnant while the cost of living soared into the stratosphere. A Spanish peasant found that even though there was more silver in the country than ever before, he could buy less food than his grandfather did. Starvation returned to the countryside not because there was a lack of food, but because the money itself was broken and worthless to the poor. However, the rich faced a different paradox, one that would insidiously destroy Spanish industry from the inside out. Because inflation made everything in Spain so expensive to produce, Spanish goods became drastically uncompetitive compared to the rest of Europe. Let us return to our shoemaker. His shoes now cost 10 silver coins because he must pay so much for leather and food. But a shoemaker in France or England, where the gold hasn't flooded in yet, can make the exact same shoes for only 2 silver coins. Faced with this price difference, the Spanish consumer stops buying local products and starts buying the cheaper imported French shoes to save money. Spain effectively became a giant funnel. The silver would arrive in Seville and be unloaded by the ton, only to leave immediately. Within weeks, that same silver would flow out of the country to France, England, the Netherlands, and Italy to pay for imports. Spain was doing all the hard work enslaving the miners, sailing the dangerous oceans, and fighting the pirates, only to hand the money to their rivals. A famous saying from the time emerged, claiming that Spain is the mouth that receives the food, chewing it for the rest of Europe. Or, as a French observer laughed while watching the economic suicide of his enemy, everything is dear in Spain except for silver. This warped economic reality fundamentally changed the culture of Spain, twisting their values and how they viewed the concept of work itself. In England and the Netherlands, the merchant class was rising, building factories, shipyards, and textile mills to sell goods to the rich Spanish. But in Spain, working for a living became seen as something shameful, a sign of low status that no self-respecting man would accept. The ideal Spaniard was not the industrious merchant or the skilled craftsman, but the hidalgo, a title literally meaning the son of something. The hidalgo was a minor noble who owned a small patch of land, did absolutely no manual labor, and lived off a government pension. The influx of easy money created a society of consumers and bureaucrats, where the ultimate goal was to extract wealth, not create it. The national dream was to get a government job near the silver tap, not to start a business or improve the land. The famous Spanish literature of this time, like Don Quixote, is full of these tragic characters who are deluded by their own pride. We see impoverished nobles who are literally starving to death but refuse to work because they believe it is beneath their station. They would rather polish their rusting armor and pretend to be rich than dirty their hands with the indignity of honest trade. While the Dutch were inventing the stock market and the English were revolutionizing agriculture, Spain was building churches and buying velvet capes. They were becoming hollow. The economy looked shiny and golden on the outside, adorned with the plunder of the Americas, but it was rotting. There was no production, no innovation, and no industry. There was only the passive, desperate wait for the next treasure fleet to arrive. This absolute reliance on the treasure fleet created a terrifying vulnerability, as the entire stability of the empire hung by a thread. If the wooden ships were delayed by storms or intercepted by enemies, the king could not pay his bills and the system would freeze. And the king, Philip II, had a voracious appetite for capital because he did not just want to be rich, he wanted to rule the world. He was so confident in his divine right that he began spending the silver before it even arrived, leveraging the future to pay for the present. Philip sat in his massive, gloomy palace El Escorial, surrounded by silent monks and mountains of paperwork, micromanaging an empire from a dark room. He was known as the Planet King, ruling over Spain, Portugal, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, the Philippines, and the vast Americas. But holding on to the entire planet is an incredibly expensive endeavor, especially when you have enemies on every single border. Philip saw himself not merely as a monarch, but as the sword of God, divinely appointed to defend the Catholic faith against all threats. He believed it was his sacred duty to crush the Protestant Reformation spreading through Europe and stop the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean. This messianic complex meant he had to fight everyone, everywhere, all the time, regardless of the staggering financial cost. This led to the wars of ego, massive conflicts driven by ideology rather than strategy, and wars are the fastest way to burn money. He fought a brutal naval war against the Ottoman Turks, culminating in the massive Battle of Lepanto, a victory that cost a fortune. He fought the French for supremacy in Italy, pouring men and resources into a never-ending contest for European dominance. But his biggest bleeding wound was the Netherlands, a Spanish possession that was becoming the rebellious epicenter of capitalism and Protestantism. The Dutch, industrious and independent, rebelled against Spanish rule and religious persecution, sparking a conflict that would drain Spain dry. Philip responded with brute force, sending the feared army of Flanders to crush the rebellion and bring the heretics to heel. This marked the beginning of the 80 Years' War, a logistical nightmare that became the Vietnam War of the 16th century. To get soldiers to the Netherlands, Spain had to march them along the Spanish road from Italy through the Alps and into northern Europe. They had to pay, feed, and clothe 70,000 men who were fighting thousands of miles from home for decades on end. And because Spanish industry had been hollowed out by inflation, they couldn't even make their own weapons to fight these wars. Spain often had to buy gunpowder and cannons from foreign merchants, sometimes ironically purchasing them from the Dutch themselves. The silver from Potosí was literally funding the enemies of Spain, circulating through the economy to buy the bullets that killed Spanish soldiers. Then came the obsession with England, a thorn in Philip's side that would drive him to the brink of financial ruin. Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant heretic in Philip's eyes, and her privateers, like Francis Drake, were stealing his silver ships. In 1588, Philip made the ultimate gamble and launched the Spanish Armada, the most expensive naval force ever assembled. It consisted of 130 ships, 30,000 men, and thousands of heavy cannons, a floating city designed for invasion. The cost was astronomical, and to pay for it, Philip didn't use the silver he had. He used the silver he hoped to get. This brings us to the dark side of Spanish finance, the asientos. Short-term, high-interest loans provided by German and Genoese bankers. Philip II was essentially taking out payday loans on an imperial scale, leveraging the credibility of his crown for quick cash. He would go to the bankers and say, "Lend me 5 million ducats now to build the Armada, and I will pay you back later." The bankers, seeing the massive ships of gold arriving each year, agreed to the loans, but at a steep price. They charged 10%, 20%, and sometimes 40% interest, knowing the king was desperate and had no other options. But the Armada was a total disaster, defeated not by a superior navy, but by bad weather, bad luck, and rigid tactics. Violent storms smashed the Spanish fleet against the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland, scattering the pride of Spain across the ocean floor. Half the fleet sank and thousands of sailors drowned, turning the grand invasion into a national tragedy of epic proportion. When the news reached Philip, he reportedly said, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the winds and waves of God." But the bankers didn't care about God's winds or the tragic loss of life. They only cared about their return on investment. The ships were at the bottom of the ocean, and the cannons were rusting in the salt water, meaning the investment was gone forever. However, the debt remained, and the interest was ticking relentlessly, turning the resource curse into a suffocating debt trap. By the 1570s, the interest payments on the national debt were larger than the entire tax revenue of the Spanish Empire. Think about that for a moment. Every single penny collected in taxes, plus every ounce of silver from America, was not enough. It was insufficient to even pay the interest on the loans, meaning they were never paying down the principal, just treading water. The king was trapped on a financial treadmill, forced to borrow increasingly large sums of money just to pay off the old debts. He mortgaged the future of Spain for generations, selling noble titles and the right to collect taxes to anyone with cash. He squeezed the peasantry until they had absolutely nothing left to give, draining the lifeblood of the country to feed the bankers. In reality, the bankers in Genoa effectively owned the Spanish Empire, pulling the strings from their counting houses in Italy. The gold would arrive in Seville, be unloaded, and immediately be transferred to the ledgers of Italian bankers without stopping. Spain had been reduced to a glorified shipping company for its creditors, doing the heavy lifting while others reaped the rewards. The system was stretched to the absolute breaking point, a house of cards waiting for a single breeze to knock it down. All it would take was one bad year, one hurricane sinking a fleet, or one pirate raid for the entire structure to collapse. We tend to think of sovereign default or a country going bankrupt as a purely modern phenomenon like Greece or Argentina. But Philip II of Spain was the true father of the sovereign default, doing it bigger and louder than anyone else. The breaking point finally arrived in the year 1557, when the wars in France and the Netherlands had drained the treasury. The treasure fleet was slightly delayed, and the bankers, sensing blood in the water, refused to lend a single coin more. Philip II stood before his stunned court and issued a royal decree that would shake the foundations of the European economy. He declared that Spain was suspending all payments to its creditors, essentially looking at the most powerful bankers and saying, "I'm not paying." It was a financial earthquake that shattered confidence. In Antwerp and Genoa, major banks collapsed overnight and wealthy families lost everything. The credit markets of Europe froze instantly, creating the 16th century equivalent of the 2008 financial crisis. But here is the true tragedy. The default did not stop the reckless spending. It just made it significantly more expensive. Because Spain was addicted to war and addicted to imports, they had to keep borrowing, but now at ruinous interest rates. The debt spiral accelerated uncontrollably, and Spain defaulted again in 1575, 1596, 1607, and 1627. It became a generational cycle of madness. Borrow, spend, crash, borrow, spend, crash, repeated until the empire was exhausted. The impact on the common Spanish people and the soldiers who fought for the crown was absolutely horrific. When the king could not pay his soldiers, the discipline of the most feared army in Europe disintegrated into chaos. In 1576, unpaid Spanish troops mutinied and sacked the city of Antwerp, their own possession, in a blind rage. They burned the financial center of northern Europe to the ground in an event known as the Spanish Fury. This senseless act destroyed the commercial hub of the empire and pushed the Dutch rebels to fight even harder for independence. Back home in Spain, the government tried a new desperate measure to keep the domestic economy functioning without silver. Since all the real money was flowing out to foreign bankers, there was no silver left for daily commerce within Spain. So, the crown began to debase the currency, stopping the minting of silver coins for the public and switching to copper. They minted billions of these copper coins called vellon, which was essentially junk money with no intrinsic value. The king forced his people to accept these copper tokens at the value of silver, creating a hidden tax on everyone. The result, predictably, was hyperinflation on top of the existing silver inflation, sending prices fluctuating wildly day by day. People began hoarding whatever silver they had left and refused to accept the worthless copper coins for their goods. The economy bifurcated completely, creating two separate worlds for the rich and the poor within the same country. The government and the wealthy elite dealt exclusively in silver and gold, insulating themselves from the disaster. Meanwhile, the poor were left trading worthless copper tokens that bought less and less food with every passing week. The middle class was effectively wiped out, their savings destroyed by the sudden devaluation of the currency they held. By the mid-1600s, the Spanish century was dead, and the glorious empire was a shadow of its former self. The mines of Potosí began to dry up, the veins ran thin, and the easy money finally stopped flowing. Because Spain had spent 100 years buying things instead of learning how to make things, they had absolutely nothing to fall back on. They had no sophisticated wool industry like England, no advanced banking sector like the Dutch, and no luxury manufacturing like the French. The great cities of Castile, once bustling with global trade and energy, emptied out as populations fell and the fields lay fallow. Spain descended into a long, dark slumber of poverty and geopolitical irrelevance, watching from the sidelines as history moved on without them. The empire that had once owned the world became pitiably known as the sick man of Europe, a cautionary tale for all others. Meanwhile, the countries that had taken Spain's silver, England and the Netherlands, had used that capital to invest in their future. They built massive merchant fleets, funded groundbreaking scientific research, and established institutions that would drive the next era of human progress. They built the stock exchange and the modern corporation, realizing the ultimate truth of economics that Spain had tragically ignored. They understood that true wealth is not the metal you dig out of the ground, but the productivity and ingenuity of your people. The Dutch used Spanish silver to build the ships that would dominate global trade for a century, effectively inheriting the oceans. The British used Spanish silver to capitalize the factories and mills that would eventually ignite the Industrial Revolution and change the world. Spain was merely the conduit, the golden funnel through which the wealth of the Americas flowed to create the modern northern European world. The silver left Spain hollowed out and empty, a shell of an empire that had been consumed by its own good fortune. The story of the Spanish Empire stands as the ultimate warning to any nation or individual about the dangers of the resource curse. Whether it is silver in 1550 or oil in the modern day, easy money breaks the critical link between work and reward. It creates a seductive illusion of prosperity, but it is actually a rot that eats away at the foundation of society. Spain drowned in gold, suffocated by the very thing they thought would save them, proving that unearned wealth is a trap. They thought they were the masters of their destiny, but in the end, they were merely slaves to their own fortune. Thank you for watching this story of rise and fall. If you want to understand more about how economies work, make sure to subscribe. We will see you in the next video, where we will uncover more hidden lessons from the history of money and power.